doing a mostly weekly show on YouTube can be somewhat difficult. There's a reason why that it almost always takes me 8 or 9 days between videos rather than just 7 and always have a video done on a set schedule. Sometimes there's an easy reason for that, like that the game that I'm reviewing is more complex. Say a late release title for the Genesis is going to have more stuff going on in it than an early Master System title. It's just the way that it is. And if that Genesis title doesn't, well, let's just say those games don't review very well. And then, of course, there's other reasons that usually come from that thing called life. Whether it's work or having to deal with family or traveling or work again, there's only so many hours in a week and I can only control so much. However, sometimes there are things that are totally under my control, and I'm going to be honest, maybe I've dropped the ball a little bit. And with that said, I'm going to take at least partial responsibility for reviewing this week's game, Super Off-Road for the Master System, about only 3 years later than I was originally supposed to. Oops. However, I should probably pause for a second because I'm sure that there's some of you out there that don't know me and are confused about why I would be talking so much about trying to keep a schedule. Believe me, I do keep up with when I upload things, and I'm just as confused about me discussing trying to keep a schedule when it's clear that I can't. Hi, my name is Dave, and welcome to Zilog and Moto, the channel where, rather than be successful by always uploading on Mondays, I'm instead out to collect and review the nearly 1,280 titles released in the English language for the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega or Mega CD as the case may be, and finally the 32X. Basically, if I can plug it into a Genesis either by itself or with some sort of add-on and be able to read what's up on the screen, I'm trying to get a copy of it and review it for posterity, with both looks at that original packaging and gameplay captured from original hardware whenever possible. Okay, so let's get back to today's game and the very belated review of Super Off-Road for the Master System. Why is it late, you ask? Don't you just kind of pick what games you're reviewing at random? Well, I wouldn't say it's fully at random, but yes, I do have some freedom in what I review when. However, I do try to keep games that are part of a series on every 100 episode schedule, and then review the next game in the series on that anniversary, so to speak. Longtime viewers might know that the Genesis version of Super Off-Road was one of the first games that I ever reviewed for the channel, which was way back in episode 11 during the first year. Super Off-Road, or Ivan Iron Man Stewart's Super Off-Road as it was called in the arcades, was one of my favorite arcade games growing up, and because of that, it was one of the first games that I wanted to review on the channel. Now, even if math isn't your strong suit, you can probably deduce that episode 244 is just slightly more than 100 episodes past episode 11. So what gives? Why did it take me so long to review this game? Well, actually there's a simple reason for that, and that's because the Master System version wasn't released until September of 1993. So not only was it a European exclusive, but it was also a late release for the console. And those two things combined make it somewhat hard to find in good condition. But I finally got a copy, so let's get into this belated review. But first, our customary look at the package. And here's my copy of Super Off-Road for the Master System. As mentioned, this was a later Master System release, so it's got that updated formatting with the smaller Sega logo and red Master System label at the top, along with the cover art inset on the spine, but still retaining the old corner labeling at the top to let the 3 people out there that didn't know that Super Off-Road was an arcade title. Since this is a desirable title in the library, I wanted to make sure that I didn't just buy any copy of it off of eBay, and I think I held out for one that was in solid condition. The outer cover is near mint, including the intact hang tab at the top, and the inner cover looks fantastic as well, seemingly not aged a day in the last 30 years. With shipping and currency conversion, I paid about $80 for this, which is high, as you can probably get just any copy of it for closer to $65, but I thought the good condition was worth the extra $15 or so just to get a nice copy. And the manual looks great as well, as you'll see in a minute. As far as the cover art goes, this is solid, and with them using the standard Master System formatting at the time, it's about what I would expect. One thing to note is that just like the Genesis, Super NES, and Game Gear versions,
the game no longer has the Ivan Iron Man Stewart branding on it. I'm assuming just due to how much later those versions came out than the original NES and home computer ports. The art used is the same art that was used on those home computer ports, just with the Toyota branding airbrushed off the trucks. I've got to say that I think this version of the artwork is definitely the best, just ahead of the NES version, and much better than the Genesis version. That Genesis version confuses me. I understand Accolade using their own art, but they went all out to get great art on most of their other early titles, with all of those like Boris Vallejo covers, so I'm really surprised to see that they kind of just half-assed a big hit title like this, but maybe they figured that the name alone was enough to sell it. Flipping over the back, and there's the traditional European rear cover where you've got to pull out the magnifying glass to read any of the text, and it's the worst possible version of that because Virgin was trying to cover 8 different languages back here. The copy isn't bad and gives a very basic description of the game, but considering that they were pressed for space, what we got with 4 trucks speed around rough and ready tracks packed with pitfalls, power boosters, and prizes is pretty good. Along with that, the 4 screenshots over to the left are all fantastic, and not only show the podium shot that the arcade version is well known for, but also 3 of the tracks, and I've got to be honest, just going on these screenshots, the game looks absolutely fantastic, and very similar to the Genesis version at first glance. Need to see it in action, of course, but so far I'm excited. One final note about the back, it's got the usual stat box at the bottom that lists 24 race configurations, and basically what that means is that the game has 12 of the tracks from the arcade, and you end up racing them forwards and reverse. So a clever way to try to make the game seem bigger than it actually is without outright lying. Also, I love how they still, even in late 1993, mention the control stick for the Master System. I don't even want to think about how much that might ruin the proceedings, trying to play this specific game with that piece of garbage. Opening up the case, and as mentioned, the manual and cartridge look great. This is a big old phone book of a manual, and I just realized how old me using the phrase phone book has got to make me seem, considering I don't think I've seen an old school phone book in probably 20 years. Moving on, it's so big because it has to cover those 8 languages, but thankfully all the languages have individual sections rather than page splitting. Super Off-Road is admittedly a relatively simple game, so you definitely do not need the manual for this one, but one thing that I really like here is that there's an appendix with each track with time entries for each, in case you wanted to keep up with your fastest times, just like the Master System manuals historically had for high score pages at the end. Okay, that's the package. Let's get dirty and see how well this 8-bit port of the game holds up. So where should we start with Super Off-Road? It's easy for someone of my age to just assume that everyone should be familiar with the game, but seeing as how I'm admittedly pretty old these days, I should probably lay out at least a little of the background information for the younger crowd. Super Off-Road, or as it was properly known in the arcades, Ivan Iron Man Stewart's Super Off-Road, was a massive arcade hit when it was first released to the arcades in 1989. The original arcade cab came in a few configurations, but probably the most notable one is the 3-player version that served to try to latch onto the multiplayer popularity of Atari's earlier Super Sprint, which was released in a very similar 3-player cabinet 3 years previous in 1986. So, other than having nicer graphics and sound, what made Super Off-Road different, and eventually much more popular than Super Sprint, you might ask? Well, first you have to understand that Super Off-Road was very much a product of its time. In the late 80s, ESPN was a very different entity, and as a much smaller company, it broadcast a much wider selection of sports, because they simply didn't have rights to some of the more major sports organizations. This led to things like Fritz von Erich's World Class Championship Wrestling, and then later on the Global Wrestling Federation getting airtime on the worldwide leader. That's right, very much third-tier regional pro wrestling airing on ESPN, and not ESPN2 or ESPN8 The Ocho or anything like that. One of the other things that ESPN used to fill time with was auto racing. Coincidentally, Mickey Thompson, a former driver, car builder, and promoter, decided to start a racing series based around Baja and off-road racing, but having the track set up in stadiums, which made the races more accessible for not just fans locally, but also television broadcast, as it was much easier to produce an event in a smaller enclosed space rather than out in the wilderness somewhere. These events featured all types of vehicles, but clearly the standouts were the motocross, ultracross events, and the Grand National Sport Trucks, with these races usually getting the most of the television time at the events. For the Grand National Sport Trucks, while there were several standout drivers, one of the stars of the circuit was Ivan Stewart, who had been given the nickname Iron Man due to his previous success during many races in Baja California. The races were always fun to watch on TV, with colorful red, white, and blue safety barrier adorned tracks, trucks that seemingly lost fenders on every lap, and copious amounts of dirt in many different configurations, meaning that while some of the tracks might have similar elements, no two races were ever the same, and even the best drivers were always just one wrong turn from leading the pack to eating all of the other drivers' dust, quite literally, with all the mud on the tracks often making it difficult for drivers not in the lead to even be able to see the track. Leland Corporation saw an opportunity here, and one licensing deal later with the series' most popular star, saw Ivan Ironman Stewart Super Off-Road dominate the arcades. This was one of the games that was much like a Double Dragon or Final Fight. If you went to the arcade and they didn't have one, it probably wasn't a very good arcade. It was so popular that it even had what people these days would refer to as DLC, and in an expansion pack called the Track Pack, that included extra tracks added to the game's code for players that had burnt themselves out on the races that came with the original release. With a game this popular, of course it was getting ported to home consoles, and one of the most notable ports of the game came in the 8-bit version for the NES, which was ported by Rare in 1990 and designed to utilize the NES 4-score adapter to allow up to 4 players, one for each of the trucks in the game, and actually one more than the arcade version, which was designed to always have at least one computer-controlled truck. Around the same time, the game also was ported to other various home computers, but of course, there was no Sega presence, and I'll let you draw your own conclusions as to why that was. Hint, it's because Nintendo were real dicks. 2 years later, as the Mickey Thompson series was winding down and long after its heyday, partially due to the murder of Mickey Thompson and his wife in 1988, but that's a whole different video, Super Off-Road would finally see release on 16-bit consoles, sans the Ivan Ironman Stewart name, with the Genesis and Super Nintendo versions, along with a portable version for Sega's Game Gear. However, there was still no sign of a Master System version. And then, all of a sudden, in September of 1993, just as Sega was starting to close up shop on the Master System in Europe, Super Off-Road magically appeared, and if you're counting, that's now almost 5 years after the arcade game was originally released. Now, I know I've spent a lot of time discussing the background on the game rather than the game itself, while footage has been running on the screen, so I probably should get to the actual review. Having said that, Super Off-Road for the Master System is a belated port of the arcade version, but also a faithful one. Like most home versions of the game except the NES version, Super Off-Road supports 2 players, with one player controlling the red truck while the other one controls the yellow, and leaving the blue and silver truck to the computer, with the silver truck being your toughest competition, going back to the silver truck representing Ivan Stewart in the arcade version. While of course having 3 or even 4 players as the NES version would have been nice, I do have to give the developers credit for having the game support 2 players, because that was not something that was always guaranteed on the Master System for arcade ports. Once you've chosen which of the trucks you want to control and entered your initials, it's off to the races. As mentioned on the back of the package, the Master System version contains 12 different track layouts for a total of 24 configurations, which means that you're getting 3/4 of what was originally included with the arcade machine and the Track Pack add-on. Also, I should point out here that while sometimes it was common for the Master System release to be more or less identical to the Game Gear release, this is not the case with today's game, as the Game Gear version that came out previously only had 8 tracks and not 12, amongst other differences, which is nice to see. Racing around the courses is relatively simple, with 1 button for gas and 1 button for nitrous boost, while pressing left or right to turn. This, of course, was one of the reasons why the game was so popular in the arcades, because almost anyone could just walk up to the cabinet and be able to play it without really having any kind of special knowledge. The goal is always to win the race, and if you don't, even if you finish on the podium and win some prize money, you'll lose a life. And there's no way to earn more, meaning if you fail to finish in first in 3 races, your day is over and it's time to start fresh. One quick additional note about the controls, I personally think that this version of the game controls well. Maybe not quite as tight as the Genesis version, but still pretty precise. Which is important because the way the tracks are structured, it can be very easy to either turn too much and get turned around, or possibly get hit by one of the other trucks and knock you out of the proper traffic path. I could see a new player getting frustrated by this, but really, it all comes down to practice and a bit of luck. The arcade version was the same way, so there's nothing new here, and when racing against a friend, things can get heated pretty quickly, which is honestly part of the fun. The prize money that you win from races, or pick up on the track, is important and adds a wrinkle that you don't often see in arcade machines because it gives you the ability to upgrade your truck in one of 4 categories, or purchase more nitrous boosts. This lends to a bit of strategy to the proceedings. Do you go for the most expensive upgrades first, like the top speed and acceleration, or do you focus on the cheaper tires and shocks that can be upgraded quicker due to the lower cost? Or do you try to upgrade everything evenly and have a more rounded vehicle? It's all up to you, and it's important to figure out what works for your driving style because the other drivers will slowly build up their trucks as well, and if you purchase the wrong upgrades or maybe burn too much money on nitrous, the silver truck especially will be leaving you in the dirt very quickly. From a graphics perspective, I think the game turned out as well as it could, and considering how late a release it was, I'd certainly hope so. There's simply no comparison between the NES version and the Master System version. Sure, you could say that the NES version supports 4 players, but any other direct comparisons between the two favor the Master System in a large way, in both graphics and sound. It certainly can't compare to the 16-bit versions of the game, but if all you had was a Master System and wanted a game that had a passing resemblance to the arcade version, this certainly got the job done. I think my only real complaint about the graphics, knowing the hardware's limitations, is that some of the hydro barriers, or the borders of the tracks, are off-screen. This is the only version without a zoomed-in view that does this, and I'm not exactly sure why. It's not a huge deal because you usually probably shouldn't be driving that close to the wall anyway, but it just looks odd. Sound-wise, I was a bit less impressed with the game, as the music and minimal sound effects certainly aren't up to the level of the game's visuals. The music isn't bad per se, but it's not really good either, as all the background tracks that play during the various levels are pretty simplistic. Although, to their credit, at least there are multiple background tracks, so that you're not stuck listening to the same music the entire time that you play the game. And when I say minimal sound effects, I mean minimal. There's samples that play when you pick up nitrous or money on the track, when you use a nitrous, and when you get close enough to a flag to make it wave, and that's about it. I know it was probably challenging to have sound effects and music going at the same time, but there's so few effects I'm almost left with wondering why they even bothered. Super Off-Road is a faithful port of the arcade hit, with a few creative liberties taken to make the game work on the Master System's less powerful hardware. There's really not much else here besides just some old school arcade racing action, with maybe just learning to master the different track configurations, so that with a little luck you can make it all the way through the game's 24 different track configurations. Although the game plays well enough that I don't know that much else besides that is needed. As a result, I'm giving Super Off-Road for the Master System 3 stars. I'm sure there's some people out there that might say that the game could have been better, being such a late release on the console, but I'm choosing not to get hung up on that. It's a solid conversion of an arcade classic, and if your only option was to play it on the Master System, you were well served.
Okay, and that is it for Super Off-Road for the Master System. When I teased a picture of this on the channel the other day, Dudley of Yesterzine fame commented, "I'm actually not super familiar with this. I've owned it since the 90s and probably haven't played it since then because the Super Nintendo version exists." And first off, I'm ignoring the fact that he says the Super Nintendo version and not the Mega Drive version. But his point still stands. If you have access to a 16-bit console, there was zero reason to wait 2 years to play this on a less powerful console. But for the less fortunate out there, I certainly don't think it's a bad thing that this game exists. Next time on Zilog and Moto, originally I had another European exclusive on the schedule in Micro Machines Turbo Tournament 96, but it seems a bit much to do 2 racing games back to back, so instead I'm going to push that one back a few episodes. In its place, I'll be looking at a game in a lesser known sports series, at least these days, that I enjoy, but I've never played this specific edition of the game. I really liked all of the crazy options that the previous game in the series had, and it's going to be hard for them to top that version, but we'll see what the developers came up with, and hopefully it's not just the same game warmed over. Well, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 244. If you like what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you are so inclined, as it'll help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun and be excellent to each other. Later.